Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Kinane. Coming up, the blueprint for a radical overhaul of Australia's media laws, a hefty pay rise for federal politicians, and The Protester gets named as Time Magazine's Person of the Year. Our panel tonight, Adam Creighton from the Centre for Independent Studies, actor and writer Reece Muldoon, and John Barron from ABC News Radio. And you can join in on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum. Well, the Convergence Review Committee has released its interim report into the future of Australia's media, and it recommends a huge shake-up to the way the media is regulated. It's calling for an end to the divide between online and traditional media, with the abolition of broadcast licences and the introduction of a regulator who oversees all media. It also recommends the axing of the cross-media ownership rules, instead having a public interest test for media ownership. The review was commissioned by the government to ensure that Australia's media regulations are up to date with the digital age. The long-awaited decision by the Remuneration Tribunal has awarded significant pay rises to politicians. So let's talk, John, about these changes and how they would change the way the media would operate in Australia. What do you think?
Well, on the surface of it, Steve, the thing that really leaps out, well, the bad news for the free-to-air broadcasters is you've got somebody at this level saying, you know what, I don't think your licences are worth much for anymore. So pretty much the couple of $100 million they've been paying, they won't have to pay that anymore because it's no longer the licence to print money that it once was. Also, a long overdue recognition of the fact that media is media and that you really can't say, whereas obviously with the ABC being TV and radio, but also online, does that make the ABC any different from Fairfax or News Limited that are running content-rich websites and so on? And so this idea that from the old days, you know, oh, well, you can only have a certain number of newspapers, certain number of capital city radio or TV channels, that it really comes down to saying, OK, let's forget about which organs you own, but let's look at this market, the opportunities to bring content to that market, and also, significantly, I think, will come into it the proprietors and whether they're good people to be running any of them.
Reece, what stood out for you in this report?
Well, I think a few things stood out. I think the losing licences, as you point out, John, is a huge one. Of going, hey, Channel 9, I mean, they're owned by a hedge fund now, so, you know, what does it matter to them? You know, I mean, Kerry Stokes will be happy, they're saving a little bit of money and all that kind of stuff. But as you say, it is also like a sort of a real wake-up call of going, guess what? It's about to change massively. You know, I mean, it's already ongoing. But the other part that I found particularly fascinating was how... And I thought the review was very... how would I put it? Measured and really quite, you know, wise, and you know what I mean? Because everybody was sort of... There's been so much talk about this review for so long about what's going to happen and what's going to happen in this review, what are they going to say? And I thought it was... I thought it read pretty much... There wasn't much I disagreed with, I have to say. And one of the main ones for mine was the support of Australian content, particularly with the ABC.
Adam, does this mean less regulation or more regulation? Well, because it seems like the internet's now going to be regulated.
Yeah, well, certainly my main concern is with the powers of the new regulator, which is proposed in the report. So there's going to be an overarching authority that basically regulates all aspects of media.
So we won't have like an ACMA anymore, which was just looking after
broadcast media. I don't
media.
think that they've come up with a name yet.
No, they haven't, but it'll be... I think it's Grand Poobah.
But it said broad and
like
substantial powers that this regulator would have. Yeah. And, I mean, fair enough, it's an arm's length from government, but I'm still a bit concerned that those regulators will basically, you know, be making arbitrary decisions about, you know, what is essentially private media and... You know, including newspapers.
Is that because you just bristle at regulators all round?
No, I just think it's, you know, it's an expansion of state power, which is not necessary.
No, it's not. No, but it's not, because what they're doing is like they're getting rid of ACMA, and the aim of the report, and one of their stated aims is to get rid of red tape, get rid of regulation, and they've had to bring in a regulator.
I'll be very surprised if there are fewer bureaucrats in the new organisation.
And John, whoever is that regulator will have some interesting decisions to make about media ownership, because the recommendation, and these are all recommendations at this stage, not government policy, is that they get rid of the cross-media ownership laws and instead insert a public interest test. So that regulator presumably would be working out what was in the public interest when it comes to who owns what media.
Yeah, and you would hope that whatever they determine, it would be a little bit clearer and a little bit faster and a little bit of a few more teeth in the tiger than poor old ACMA has tended to have as well. But of course, if you're saying that the licence to broadcast or to publish isn't worth so much these days because people are just as likely to read the LA Times as the Melbourne Age, then it comes down to what are your sanctions? And at the moment, the big ticket sort of regulation that exists is, we're going to make you make a whole lot of Australian content. That's the most expensive requirement that is coming through in all of this, that you've got to produce this amount of local content. And there is an argument that says, well, given the diversification in the sector now, do we want to continue do we have the right to continue to ask people who are competing globally now to produce local content?
Well, we'll talk to Glenn Boreham a little later about this, and we'll ask him a few questions. He's the chair of that committee, and we'll find out exactly what the motivations were behind some of these decisions. Moving on to other issues now, and the long-awaited decision by the Remuneration Tribunal has awarded significant pay rises to politicians. The tribunal has recommended that the base salary for parliamentarians rise by $45,000 to $185,000 per annum. A cabinet minister would get an extra 72.5% allowance. Shadow ministers get an increased salary for the first time with an extra $25,000 allowance. The Prime Minister's salary is set to rise to $481,000, which would mean that she or he will be paid more than both of the US President Barack Obama and the UK Prime Minister. But the news is not all good for parliamentarians, with the pay rises replacing some entitlements. Overseas travel allowances to be abolished, as is the lifetime gold pass, which enables former MPs to travel for free. However, the electoral allowance will remain in place, as it's considered to be a business expense by the tribunal. Greens leader Bob Brown agrees the entitlements are a rort, but has questioned the timing of the pay increases.
You have the big party politicians washing their hands of their responsibility for a huge pay rise at a time the government is cutting public service jobs so that the budget can stay in the black. The gold passes should go for all MPs, past, present and future MPs. It's a rort.
But the Special Secretary of State, Gary Gray, has welcomed the changes and the greater transparency they will bring.
Key thing for me is transparency, independence and the capacity to make determinations and not to give to politicians the ability to make these decisions. You see, classically what a politician will do is not take a pay rise, but pay themselves a non-transparent, non-reportable salary-like benefit. And that's characterised our politicians' payment system for the last 50 years.
The tribunal won't say when the changes will take place because under current legislation, the recommendations would give a massive windfall to retired MPs. John Condy, the tribunal president, has called on the government to change the legislation to prevent this. Now, Reece, you don't expect that this is going to go down well in the community, but
it's not going to go down well at the Daily Telegraph, is what you mean. That's what you mean.
Is it fair, though?
Well, I think politicians are underpaid, absolutely. I've said this, I've stated this publicly on many occasions, and I think that the changes that they've done, what they've said no to, like gold passes and all that sort of stuff, and bumped up the wages of politicians is fair enough. And just I would point out, like, I take issue with a certain point that was made in what you were just sort of speaking about, which is that the US President and the UK Prime Minister get less. Well, yeah. I mean, you know, the US president, I think it's like 100,000, maybe it's gone up to 300,000 now. I think it was 100,000 for a long, long time. It's a nominal fee. It's like a little gentle whatever. I mean, you can't compare. It's apples and oranges. And
why can't you compare?
Well, because, I mean...
They get free accommodation for a start. It's a nice place.
Yeah, they get free accommodation. But, I mean, America is just so big and so wealthy. It's like with the Air Force. I know that former officers and pilots just get free air travel for the rest of their lives. You will not see that here. But I'm saying that... you know, if you're the US president, you are set for life. There's no question with speaking tours and whatever happens after that. While if you're a politician in Australia, you actually have to have a bit of wage, so it's not just left up to the moneyed class who get to become politicians. You need people that go, and it's not big cash, I would add. Okay. Like 185,000, that's like second year thing for a Gen Y person. It's like if I don't get 185, I'm
You can get that in the mines. Yeah. Adam, what are your thoughts?
I just want to completely disagree with Reece. I mean, I think people should be very, very angry. This is a very unseemly transfer of wealth from ordinary people to people who already earn a huge incomes in probably the top 4 or 5% of the income distribution. And, I mean, it's relative not only to other Australians but also to other MPs around the world. I mean, for instance, British MPs, I think, get about £60,000 a year.
But they get their moat cleaned.
No, but it's just, you know, politicians think that they're underpaid because they mix with people who earn a lot of money. But the people that they represent, the overwhelming majority of Australians earn about, 50 or 60 grand a year. And I just think this is I mean, it's not only the timing. I mean, not only the timing. I mean, the timing is very, very bad.
I agree the timing's
But
not awesome.
It's more than just timing. It's just very, very wrong. This is morally wrong.
John?
Yeah, look, on the one hand, I sort of think the Prime Minister of Australia being paid close to $500,000 a year is probably not enough, given that Gail Kelly, the head of Westpac, is getting about $10 million a year. I think the jobs are commensurate in terms of the level of responsibility and the skills required. Whether we choose to support a particular politician or a particular bank, that is what is required at that level of management. And if the Prime Minister or the Treasurer is not a significantly talented manager, then we're all in a lot of trouble. But by the same token, they've all just received about a 20% pay rise. This remuneration tribunal, I imagine there are a few Qantas pilots and baggage handlers at the moment thinking, gee, could they sort out our pay claims as well?
Or anyone who's having the 4% efficiency dividend applied to their
Yeah, exactly right.
But I just find it, look, everybody squawks and screams every time the politicians get a pay rise. I just don't think it's massive coin. I got $185,000 a year for a backbencher. That is not big coin. Like, it's not. That's not. You don't go like, well, that's where I'm heading because I'll be on the gravy train with my 185 grand. Come on, it's not.
Certainly in the context of the budget, you know, these are very, very small sums. But I mean, it's the principle
And
involved.
compared to people with similar skills in the private
politicians,
sector,
you know, get very substantial non-pecuniary benefits from their jobs, right? I mean, these are public offices, they're very prestigious. You know, you get some power. I mean, you can't really compare the Prime Minister with Gail Kelly. I mean, it's completely different.
No, they're different realms.
And yet politicians, when they leave office, then they haven't been making a whole lot of money. They've still got a mortgage to pay off. What do? They go and sit on boards, or they do lobbying and consulting work, where possibly they're compromising themselves through what they're disclosing and the context that they're exploiting.
Well,
so maybe we should be paying them better up front.
John, one thing that will be abolished is the overseas study travel, which will mean no more study trips like the one Craig Thompson took, which was exposed by Philip Dorling in the Fairfax papers today. Tell us a bit more about that and what he worked on.
It's funny how these study trips tend to be to the south of France rather than sub-Saharan Africa.
To Pagan in Paris, for example.
It's always the way. Look, one of the things that is required so that these overseas study trips aren't a complete rort is that you have to do what amounts to what I did on my holiday report, first day back at school. So Craig Thompson was running a little bit late on this. He had a few, I guess, other issues on his mind at the time. So apparently slapped together the report of his study trip by quoting from not quite enough sources. You know, they talk about research and plagiarism being how many sources you use. Well, this perhaps was less than fully substantiated research when it came to sourcing quotes from Wikipedia, speeches made by central bank governors and so on, that it wasn't clear that he wasn't purporting it to be his work. So
Mr. Thompson, when you say it was the best of times, it was the worst of times.
And Adam, he spent 6 weeks in Britain, Ireland, France, Spain and the US discovering what Australia could learn from the global downturn. Now, he could have just got a subscription to The Economist, couldn't he?
Well, that's right. I mean, certainly these trips are a vestige of a bygone era when politicians would go and see the empire and they'd have to, you know, and it was actually a big deal to go overseas. You know, I mean, 100 years ago it was a very big deal to go overseas.
So you must be happy at least they're abolishing that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's a very sensible rationalisation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, as the US military prepares to leave Iraq at the end of this month, Barack Obama travelled to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to welcome home some of the troops.
Proud to finally say these two words, and I know your families agree. Welcome home. Welcome home. Welcome home. Now, Iraq's not a perfect place. It has many challenges ahead. But we're leaving behind a sovereign, stable, and self-reliant Iraq.
The speech is being seen as part of the president's re-election campaign now, John. He was talking there about leaving behind a sovereign, stable and self-reliant Iraq. Now, this must have been awkward for Barack Obama because for a long time he said it's a dumb war.
Right, exactly right. So, but now he's the Commander-in-Chief and he's welcoming home these members of the 82nd Airborne Division to Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And the last thing they want to hear is him going, well, you know, thanks very much, that was a dumb war.
Yeah,
So it's a fine line. And, of course, it's a fine line as well domestically because the base of the Democratic Party, the left wing of the Democratic Party that was all against the war, that voted for Howard Dean in 2004, that voted for Obama in 2008, because he originally voted against the war in Iraq, which Hillary Clinton and John Edwards, the other front runners, had not. So he always staked his claim on being, I was right on Iraq because Iraq was wrong. So this is a little bit tricky for him now. He's maintained that the right war and the war that he has continued to expand is Afghanistan, but it's causing problems with his base because it took him 3 years to end the war in Iraq, and now Afghanistan, there's still a ways to go.
Reece?
I think, look, having seen the speech too, I mean, you're absolutely right that it's a very tricky sort of area that he's in, but being an insomniac and watching that live last night at 4:19 a.m, I think it was, he's just such an amazing speaker. Like, it's that sort of thing of going, well, this sort of Bush disaster, and he's sort of got to clean it up with this great speech. But I thought it was an incredible speech, and really kind of moving, even though he focused on how much they're going to look after the troops when they get home. Once they get home, not just the troops, their families, and all that sort of stuff. Which for mine is underneath that is going like, because this thing ain't right. But it's very underneath. You know, that's how I would argue that he played it. But I thought it was, you know, he's just an incredible speaker.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it might have been a very good speech, but I think the President left out one crucial reason as to why the US is withdrawing, and that's obviously the financial situation of the United States.
Well, how much does it cost them? How much is the Iraq
war
US
revenues is devoted to military spending. I mean, military spending by the US is completely out of control, and the US government has an enormous budget deficit. Military spending, I think, has been growing about 10% real every single year for the past 10 years.
Isn't this the first war that was built that was paid for on debt?
And sorry, it's cost $1 trillion. It's cost $1 trillion.
$1 trillion.
$1 trillion. Yeah, but on debt, I believe. That's my understanding is it's the first war that's all been borrowed.
It's all been borrowed. Yeah, it's all been borrowed. So I think that's the real reason. I think it's got less to do with military reasons and more to do with economic reasons.
Okay, well, still in the US, then Army Private Bradley Manning, who's accused of giving classified material to WikiLeaks, will face his first hearing tomorrow. The 23-year-old has been imprisoned by the military for the last 17 months, the last 10 months in solitary confinement. He's facing more than 30 charges, including a count of aiding the enemy. If the charges are proved, the penalties could be life imprisonment or even the death penalty. Public opinion on Manning is divided, with many seeing him as a traitor, while others believe he is a hero. John, the hearing starts tomorrow, and I guess this is all about, whether he will be court-martialed or not. A lot of people will be watching this case, won't they, with a lot of interest?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The more we're about to see the legal process begin after almost 18 months of imprisonment pre-trial for Bradley Manning. What's interesting, though, is not just the evidence that we're hearing about how he's bearing up after 18 months incarceration, but we're also hearing more and more about his mental state at the time of the alleged crimes. And that he was suicidal, that a military psychiatrist had said, this guy shouldn't be carrying a gun just quietly. And there's evidence of him having gender identity issues, having been teased about his height and his sexuality, all these sorts of things. What's fascinating about all that is it's coming from his defence attorney. So we're getting a picture here about who Bradley Manning is that is somewhat less than heroic in an attempt that he will hopefully, as far as his supporters are concerned, not spend 30 years behind bars. But in the process, they're taking him down a few pegs, perhaps.
Reece, what do you think about the way the US has handled this case?
Oh, look, it's another one of those cases where Guantanamo stuff, like when the Americans sort of go like, guess what, the gloves are off and we just want to just go and get someone, they go and get someone. Yeah. They don't worry too much about it.
I think it reflects really poorly, I think, on internal processes in the military there. I mean, how did a 23-year-old guy like this, with mental issues, have access to all this information and be in the desert in the military? I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, So, I mean, he's obviously, committed a very serious crime, and, I mean, he'll get a very serious punishment, I think. But, the broader issue for the US is how did it happen in the first place?
Well, Adam, the prosecutors are recommending that he be given life imprisonment. If it's true, if it's proven that he was the person who leaked those 250,000 cables to WikiLeaks, if that's true, does that warrant life imprisonment?
Well, I mean, who am I to judge? I mean, I think it's probably better than the death penalty, which I think is another option. But, I mean, I don't know. The judges will make the decision. I don't really have a view. I mean, it's a very serious crime. He did a really, really stupid thing. So he deserves to be punished. There's no question.
It's so tricky because he did sort of like... It's as you say, like it's a stupid thing. It's also a sort of crazy brave thing. It's depending on where you sit. Of course, like you're going, of course it's sort of betraying the trust of his own country and his own uniform, which is absolutely true. But then on a wider issue...
Sure. Well, that's a separate question.
It's very tough.
It's a separate question. I mean, the court's not going to adjudicate on that.
No, I know.
And of course,
I've just got my own conscience about the whole thing.
And what's going to be interesting for us, used to the civilian court process, to see how the military tries this case, because there is a whole issue of he has signed up to laws that are above and beyond the law of the land, that this is, you're a serving officer, you will not do these following things.
That's right.
So there's almost this sense of, we don't have to prove the guy's guilty. We know he did it. So the question is, can they mitigate it in his defence to say, well, he didn't know what he was doing, in a way he was a casualty of war.
But getting back
to whether how much harm, if he did this, if he was the person who leaked these cables, How much harm did it cause? I mean, Robert Gates, the Pentagon chief, has dismissed the impact of the diplomatic cables being released.
Most people haven't said it's just high-end gossip.
And Gates said it was fairly modest. So if it is fairly modest, if it hasn't had that much impact...
whatever that super spy guy was, I can't remember his last name, the guy who, basically gave the Russians everything. It's certainly not in that ballpark at all, So it's a tricky one.
Certainly there's the potential there for serious harm, and that's why it's illegal in the first place. It's not whether there has been any harm caused. That's kind of irrelevant, I think.
Interesting too that UN's special rapporteur for torture has complained that he couldn't get access to Manning without being monitored. That he was suggesting that here is a democratic country like the US not being transparent about how they're holding him and allowing people like him to go and see him.
And again, in a military prison, your rights are different to being in a civilian prison.
Indeed. Yeah.
Okay, Time magazine has unveiled its Person of the Year, and the unusual choice is raising a few eyebrows. It's not an individual, but the symbolic protester, wherever they are, in a tribute to power of the people. Time magazine says protesters around the world, from the Arab Spring to Occupy Wall Street, have changed history. Adam, what do you think of Time magazine's decision?
I think it's a fairly good choice. I mean, I think certainly this year has been a watershed, I think, at least in economic history. I think it's starting to look that way. I mean, the Occupy protesters, certainly they included lots of silly people, but they really, in terms of their scope and their duration, were really, really very impressive. And the fact that they united socialist alternative on the one hand with the Tea Party on the other, that's quite an amazing phenomenon.
That is quite amazing.
And it certainly says that there is something deeply wrong with the economic system when you have those groups agreeing with each other. So.
John?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, I agree with Adam, but on the other, the Time magazine Person of the Year, it's a rogues gallery, to say the least.
Indeed.
Hitler, Stalin, and Mark Zuckerberg. And I always think it's a bit of
just a bunch of guys who couldn't pull chicks.
Yeah,
I know.
And when they, and I also, it feels like a bit of a cop out as well when it's not a person. It is the Time magazine Person of the Year is all of you a few years ago.
But they could make it, if they wanted to make it about...
Yeah, that's right, I remember that.
If they wanted to make it about a person, they could have made it Mohammed Bouazizi, the Tunisian vendor who started the whole Arab Spring. I mean, if they wanted it...
Or they wouldn't have sold. Steve, of course,
they wouldn't have sold.
I don't know how many copies they would have sold. They wouldn't have sold as many.
What gets me is Kate Middleton was one of the runner-ups.
Come on.
So, interesting judgment.
Now, Reece, some interesting comments on the ABC Facebook page about this today.
Oh, yeah.
So, Times Person of the Year was a mob of stoned, unwashed, moral entrepreneurs who believe that corporate greed can be eliminated with an illegal camping trip defined by the incoherent yelling of poorly thought-out slogans.
Well, I know I wrote that today. Look, I mean, it's so... Look, the Occupy thing is... again, I have such mixed feelings on it as well, where I go like, what do we want? Good public transport. Oh, shit, we got that. What do we want? Clean water. Oh, damn, we got that. There's so much stuff where it's very easy to sort of tease the Occupy thing. But when you see it on a global scale, there's certainly something to it. In that people are dissatisfied with how the thing is rolling.
And the fact that it is manifesting itself with just a sense of discontent, be it in Moscow now, be it in the Middle East, be it in the United States. Interesting that we haven't seen it in this country, despite attempts on both sides to really kind of gin that up in this country in recent times, to say, can we get people angry? Can we get a Tea Party? Can we get an Occupy movement?
But of course,
happening?
all human, any human sort of endeavour, it comes from dissatisfaction.
Right. And then it's a matter of, we've got a crowd here, what are we going to stand for?
I know.
If you got rid of negative gearing, there'd be a riot, though, wouldn't there, John?
There would have to be in this country.
Or the first-time buyers allowance.
Baby bonus, maybe.
Baby bonus dropped down to 5,000. What the greatest non-story of the year.
Yeah, or if middle-class welfare chopped out at 90,000, Reece, there'd be people on the streets, wouldn't there?
Please. Yeah, because... look, firstly, having been to a few protests, and I've got to say how much I loathe protests. So the only time I ever go to one is when I really, really mean it, because I really hate them. They're just so appalling, and the worst person always gets the megaphone and stuff like that. Yeah. So, I haven't rushed along to the...
I'd like the concession for the coffee cart at that protest, though. That'd be fun.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Coming up next on The Drum, some fundamental changes planned for the regulation of Australia's media. We're going to be joined by Glenn Boreham, the chair of the Convergence Review Committee, which recommended that shake-up.
Can you beat Obama? Yes. He has few endorsements from establishment Republicans who worry about his record and self-discipline. His rivals accuse him of earning millions influence peddling and of being too much of a Washington insider.
A number of international journalists have entered the country in the last week. For many of us who work in the region, for the first time with official permission. It'll only be next time we apply for a visa to enter the country that we'll know if that was a one-off or if it represents a shift in policy.
In a formal but very colourful ceremony, Indonesia took ownership of the 3 patrol boats that you see behind me. The Chief of Police thanked Australia and said the boats will help his officers do their job better. And that includes combating terrorism and, of course, people smuggling. And that issue was underscored by the fact that during the ceremony, a boat was intercepted near Christmas Island.
The World, weeknights. In a new tonic, we examine how hydrotherapy can help sufferers of severe skin conditions like eczema and psoriasis.
What we know about both eczema and psoriasis is that they're genetic and then influenced by environmental factors.
Plus, chronic illness. How well do you know your body?
How you help them frame what's going on in their own bodies is what's critical.
Tonic, Season 2, Sunday on ABC News 24.
A review commissioned by the federal government has proposed an overhaul of media regulation in Australia. Among other things, the interim report by the Convergence Review Committee says that cross-media laws should be scrapped. And joining us now in the studio is Glenn Boreham, who chaired that committee. Glenn, welcome to the Drum.
Steve.
Let's deal with one of the proposals first, the removal of content licences. What does this mean and what are you hoping to achieve with that proposal?
Yeah, when we started the review, we said let's start at first principles, and the first principle we come up with was the freedom to communicate, that Australians should have the freedom to communicate, and the government should only intervene where there's a defined public benefit. So as a result of that, when we looked at content licences, licences were primarily put in place to manage scarcity, to manage scarce public spectrum. That's over. Scarcity's gone. You can communicate over the internet and via multiple other ways. The concept of content licences are no longer relevant. So much of the regulation and so much of the legislation that's now 1,000 pages is based on concepts of licences. So by doing away with licences, you can do away with vast amounts of regulation.
OK, so you recommend a policy framework that's instead built around, it's not built around print or a broadcast or online, but content service enterprises. Now, who qualifies as a content service enterprise?
It's something that we're looking in the next stage. So interim report, we final report in March. We're looking for feedback on that because there's some really big decisions as to where you draw the lines and what the thresholds are. But the idea is, traditionally we've looked at the media via delivery platform, broadcast television, over the wireless radio, internet. That's over. It's any to any in the modern world. So what we're looking to regulate is an enterprise, but think of big brands today. If you look and feel like Channel 7, 9 and 10, if you look and feel like 2GB or Triple M, but you just happen to distribute your product via the internet, you should be deemed a content service.
OK, what about small scale? What about someone with a YouTube channel or someone who's a blogger?
Yeah,
do they qualify?
Absolutely not. And I'm glad you asked that question because there was some stuff in the press today that, regulating the internet, etc. Absolutely not.
Okay.
Think of big brands, think of large enterprises. That's where we're targeting.
OK, let's talk some big brands.
Yeah.
Google, Twitter, Facebook. Would they qualify?
I think that's a debate that we should have as we get towards a final report. If you stand back from it, YouTube are taking lots of Australian eyeballs. They've got a significant commercial operation in Australia, which is terrific. They're making money from Australian audiences. Should they contribute to Australian content? Should they? That's the question we're asking.
Because that's part of the recommendation, isn't it, that these content service enterprises contribute to a fund that would fund Australian content. So potentially you'd be asking YouTube and Google to fund Australian content. I don't imagine they'd take too well to that.
They may not. But, what we heard when we went out to the public was that Australian content, Australian stories, things of cultural significance to us are important in our media. The reality is, and I'm a free market person coming from 25 years in private life, the reality is there is a market failure as it relates to Australian content. High quality Australian drama, The Slap on ABC, Packed to the Rafters, Underbelly, over $1 million an hour to make versus 50 to 100K to buy product from the US, a detective series, a crime series, already made, already recouped the production costs. So there is a market failure that needs to be addressed. The contribution to a fund is only one avenue to that. We're recommending that government will need to increase direct funding over time to support Australian content. We're recommending a strong ABC and SBS as part of the Australian fabric. So it is only one part of it, and something I think should be debated.
But just to get back to, say, the big names like a YouTube, how would you convince them to kick money into to fund something like the slap?
Yeah, well you wouldn't. So first of all, and this is all hypothetical, because this is all to be where the thresholds are set and who falls in. But you may say you're deemed to be a content services enterprise based on the number of users, the number of subscribers, the number of viewers, your commercial model, whether your content is directed towards Australian audiences. Then if you fall into that remit, into that regulatory regime, the first preference would be you make Australian content. So a YouTube or equivalent may say, look, we will think of an innovative way to wrap Australian content around our user-generated service. We'll do an editorial. We'll do some insight into the content. So that's the preferred model, that these companies say, hey, we want to contribute to the fabric of Australia. We want to contribute to the country we're operating in. We'll do it. If you can't, there may be people that say, well, we actually can't. We don't have the skills, capacity, capability to commission any sort of Australian work. Then the default is a small contribution into Australian Content Fund. If I can add, the view would be, though, that Content Fund would then be contestable for all Australians with an objective to support innovative new platforms and concepts. So it may actually be a bit of a virtuous circle in that it's the kids that could apply to the fund to get a $10,000 grant, to get a start-up $20,000 grant. Then you promote that on YouTube, so it goes right through a life cycle.
Adam?
Can I just ask, regardless of whatever the regulations actually come to say, to the extent that they do impinge on the internet, will they be very difficult to enforce, given the nature of the internet and also the companies operating on the internet?
It's something we've considered, and again, it's important that you target this at the big brands. So most of the big organisations you could think could possibly fall into this remit have significant operations in Australia. They may host their content offshore. They have Australian licensed offices.
So Google would fall under that?
They would. They generate revenue in Australia. They've got registered businesses in Australia. And again, if you target it at the right level, I know, coming from corporate life, these are companies that care about their reputation. They actually care about their image. They want to be a good public citizen in Australia, so it's a good thing to do. I mean, overwhelmingly, we spent 3 weeks travelling around Australia doing town halls with the public, one city a day. And overwhelmingly we heard people say, Australian stories are important to us. The government and the industry have got to do what they can to protect that.
On that question of mandating drama, you talk about being sort of a free market here in principle, and you see a market failure here. Some would argue, in fact, the failure isn't in the market, it is in the ability to make Australian drama that pays for itself. And I say this in the knowledge that I'm sitting next to an actor who's in better shape than me. But I would suggest that maybe a little bit like radio in the 1950s, when there's nobody saying, oh, you've got to keep doing dramas on radio, or you've got to keep doing quiz shows on radio. Maybe Australian free-to-air TV isn't the place for $1 million an hour drama. Maybe the place for that is out of Hollywood. Maybe it's in movies. Maybe it's in acted out e-books. It might be something else entirely. What makes you so convinced that free-to-air TV, which your review seems to be suggesting maybe ain't what it used to be anyway, should be compelled as a kind of a requirement for existing to keep doing this stuff?
The reason that I think it's important is that the facts are we know when it's made, Australian audiences embrace it.
Television top 10 is always Australian product.
They embrace Underbelly, they embrace Pack to the Rafters, they embrace Slap. So there is a...
But why does it need to be subsidised?
It needs to be subsidised because Australia is it's not a completely unique position, but it's a relatively unique position in terms of our cultural closeness to the US market, to the US and to the UK. So you've got these enormous markets creating content. If you're a shareholder of one of the commercial free-to-air stations, not necessarily the chief executive or the executive, you're a shareholder, you'd say, I can buy a show like a CSI genre show for $50,000 an hour. It's made in the US, they recoup their investments, make their profits in the US, and then on-sell it incrementally to other markets. I can buy that for $50,000 an hour. I can buy The Simpsons for $50,000 an hour, or I can make $1 million an hour Australian show. If there wasn't support, there would unquestionably be a massive decline in the number of Australian stories on our screen.
And especially with the producer offset, obviously. But I think it's interesting that you've recommended that it goes into television as well.
Yeah.
That the producer offset goes from film into television as well, so into sort of quality drama is the idea.
And our logic behind that was, in a converged world, the traditional lines between feature films and miniseries on TV, it's not dissimilar to where you were taking it. Yeah. The lines are blurred. So what is the difference between high-quality production, a mini-series on a television?
Well, I understand the kind of the cultural argument, a little bit like we still want to build Holden cars here, but the reality is whether it's Holden cars or whether it's drama, you've increasingly got to look at a global audience anyway, so you end up telling stories that may as well have been shot in New York because you're looking for those overseas sales.
Oh, no, that's
to make
to say that they might as well be shot in New York is going a little bit far.
But this is what...
it's set in the Etamoga pub. But why don't we just shoot it in New York?
But you've got to get co-production partnerships to get
of
funding
course you
from
do.
the Australian government
it's still,
to say,
it's
we're
still,
going to sell this to Italy, we're going to sell it to Canada.
It's not free money. You're misunderstanding this. Of course, you want to sell the thing, obviously, to your own market, and then to on-sell it to lots of other markets. And one of the ways you sell it is going, look how unique our product is. It's from Australia. How exotic.
So Australian taxpayers are subsidising the television viewing habits of Canadians.
No, but to answer your question, if you look at Australian feature film that's been successful, you look at the top 20, they all have a quirky Australianness about it. It's the Crocodile Dundee, the Muriel's Wedding, the Red Dog, just took $21 million at the box office. So the idea that we're just kind of making American-type stuff rebadged as Australia.
Or it's just the Australia that America expects to see.
Glenn, I want to ask you about something you say that's in the report about the ABC and the SBS, and it says that the charter should reflect the range of services, including online activities. And it says this will give commercial operators increased certainty about the boundaries of public broadcaster activities. What are the boundaries of public broadcaster activities?
Well, we took 280 submissions and some 2,700 pages, and in some of the submissions there was an argument that the ABC is actually operating outside of its charter. Remember, the charter was established 30 years ago, pre-internet, pre-online, and therefore, by implication, the ABC should pare back.
In online?
In online. I mean, there is nothing in the ABC Charter that specifically says you should be operating online.
And do you agree with that argument?
No. So our view was, and in fact, I have an opinion that in some areas of online, ABC has led with innovation in iPhone and iPad applications, that sort of thing. So I think what should be done is not a referendum on the ABC Charter, but let's make the ABC Charter contemporary, representing its current footprint. That gives the ABC some protection from those that say, hey, you shouldn't be in this space, but it also does give the commercial enterprises some degree of where the new boundaries lie.
All right, let's talk about cross-media ownership laws. Why should they be abolished?
I'm glad you asked me, because they shouldn't be abolished. What we have said is that there are a number of existing cross-media ownership laws that are irrelevant in the modern world. One is that commercial TV operators can only own licences that cover 75% of Australia, so it's the 75% rule. Clearly irrelevant in a world where I can watch TV online, either real-time or in catch-up TV. It's over. It's not a relevant law. You can't enforce it. I could watch anything from anywhere at any time. Saying that you can only have 75% of Australia, irrelevant. 2 out of 3 rule was valid when there was TV, there was radio, and there was print, and they were all different. They're now not different. Yesterday I did an interview for the Sydney Morning Herald. They videoed. It's audio-visual as well as print. Where do these lines start and end? But what we're saying is the rule that exists today that is relevant is called a diversity of voices rule. And what that says is in any metropolitan market, there needs to be 5 distinct voices. Distinct voices is a cute phrase for individual owners, distinct owners, 4 in a regional market. What we're saying is that rule is valid. That's what Australians want. They want a diversity of ownership. They want diversity of voices. That rule today doesn't include subscription television. They have a voice. It doesn't include national newspapers. They have a voice. It doesn't include online. They have a voice. So what we're saying, upgrade the rule. It might become there needs to be 8 or 9 distinct voices in a market. Upgrade that rule. then underneath that, look at everything else with a public interest test.
OK, Glenn, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for coming and explaining what's in the report, and it's now over to government and see what happens when they get their hands on it.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks to all our guests today on The Drum, Adam Creighton, Reece Muldoon and John Barron. You can check out the website at abc.net.au/The Drum, and Wilco will be at this desk tomorrow night with all the sports news. See you later.